So there's some things that we need to know, background information that we need to know to really get a feel for why he's writing The City of God, which is the book from which your selections come, okay? So a little bit of background here before Augustine, okay? We need to know that the Romans, of course, as you all know, I'm sure, persecuted Christians for a long time, you know, torturing them, the arena, because they were a threat. They were a threat to their traditions, they were a threat to their religious beliefs, they were a political threat, okay? So the persecution of the Christians came to an end roughly around 305 AD. And in 312, something happened that has been sort of mythologized. But what we know is that Constantine and Maxentius, they were rivals for the emperorship of Rome. And they battled with each other. And during the course of one of these, the decisive battle between these two rivals, Constantine said that he saw a vision. And that vision was of the symbol of the cross. Okay? And he wasn't a Christian, although people thought that he was perhaps more friendly or more tolerant towards Christians than Maxentius. Okay? But he wasn't a Christian at the time. But he saw this vision or this dream. And as a result of that, supposedly he went into that final battle against his rival with the Christian banner. Okay? And he won, which kind of goes along with the pagan tradition as well, because in the pagan tradition, the right God is the God that wins your battles. Okay? And so it resonated with people. Okay? That Constantine was willing to say he had this vision, that he was willing to go into battle with this banner. And he won, and so he became emperor, and he legalized Christianity as a religion in 313. He didn't ban Roman paganism, but he legalized Christianity. Okay? So that's in the background, and so by the time Augustine was born, okay, Christianity had been a legal religion in Rome for quite some time. Okay? Now, but what did happen during Augustine's lifetime that made Christianity again controversial was that Rome began to crumble. As you all know as well, I'm sure from your history courses, Rome began to crumble because the barbarians, the European barbarians, attacked and became even more difficult to control, and eventually we have the sack of Rome. And in the wake of that, people began to really question the strength of Christianity. Again, from the old-fashioned traditional Roman perspective of paganism, if your country wasn't strong and if you haven't won a battle, maybe it's because your God isn't strong enough. Okay? So there was still this mentality here, okay? And so people were very angry about it, and they were questioning it. How could this terrible devastation happen if our God is the right God, if he's the most powerful God? You know, how could our city be destroyed? How could our women be raped? We find commentary of that in Augustine's work, okay? How could good Christians be so mistreated? All right, so it began to be questioned. Did we take the right path in choosing Christianity? Okay? And this is an old story, is it not? I mean, it's very common for people for their faith to be shaken when something truly devastating happens. Okay? People often say you get faith in foxholes, but you can also lose it. So it goes both ways. Okay? And for these people, they looked at somebody like Augustine, who by then was a convert to Christianity and somebody who was an outspoken proponent of it. And just like Socrates got questioned in the wake of the Peloponnesian War and in the wake of the defeat there, Augustine started to be questioned and criticized by people as a representative of this, embrace of Christianity. Okay? So people's faith was shaken. There were a lot of pagans left in Rome who began to say, our way was the right way. They blamed this teaching of meekness or mildness, this emphasis on turning the other cheek and forgiveness, which they criticized as a sort of soft aspect of Christianity that didn't make people warlike and tough enough to be able to defend themselves against their enemies. Okay? So the City of God was written after this attack in a response to these criticisms, trying to show why Christianity was still the right religion and why it was not to blame for what had happened here. Okay? So you might say this is kind of a step in the direction of the de-paganization, or the sort of more of the spiritual concentration, okay, in Christianity. So his job here is to explain Christianity's relationship to the state. Okay? So he develops the idea that there is a city of God and then there's a city of man. Okay? And he asks the question, what is the relationship between the two? The city of God is a heavenly city. It doesn't exist fully on earth. It's God's kingdom. Okay? And we see some evidence of it around us, such as the institution of the church, religious people, and so forth, but it doesn't exist in its completion here. It's the heavenly city. And then we have the city of man, which is the earthly city, with its political regimes, with its politics, with all of the bad as well as the good choices that people make, the wars, and so forth. Okay? So what is the relationship between the city of God and the city of man, and what is Christianity's true role in human affairs? Should we look to it, he's asking, should we look to it to solve these types of problems? Should we look to the Christian God to defend us in this way? If not, why not? Okay? How should we view Christianity so that we don't feel as though we are being abandoned when these things happen? So this is a really important question, okay, for anybody like Augustine, who was by then a devout Christian, and for many, many other people there. Okay? And it's a very enduring question, I think, not just for Christianity, but for a lot of other religions too. So let me tell you a little bit about Augustine, how he developed, how he became a Christian, because he originally wasn't a Christian. He came out of a family that was both pagan and Christian. His father was a Roman pagan, and his mother was a Christian convert, Monica. Monica is famous because she became Saint Monica. She's famous because of her role in trying to convert her son, Augustine. Okay? So they came from Algeria, and he started out as a sort of nominal Christian because his mother was a Christian, and typically mothers have more influence on these things than fathers. But as he began to receive his education, and especially as he got into his teenage and early adult years, the more that he studied philosophy and rhetoric, the more that he pulled away from what Christian beliefs he had. It was easy for him to question them and to think of them as less sophisticated than the sophistic philosophy that he was learning. And if you all have taken that intro class again, you kind of know what I mean by sophistry, right? The sophist is somebody who very much focuses on the worldly things, on power, on obtaining influence and control. They downplay the moral rules. They're not very focused on religious issues, okay? So he was attracted to that. It's sort of like he went off to college and lost his religion, a common story, I guess. And then later on in life, he got it back. But it was a very, very long and kind of nasty road for Augustine. After his education, he himself became a teacher, and so he filled that role of the sophist in that capacity, traveling, gaining students, charging tuition to teach them what he knew about philosophy and about rhetoric. Okay? And along the way, he enjoyed high civilization. He was a man of the city, and all of the things that come with that. He liked to drink. He liked to party. He had a lot of friends, and he loved to, sort of like graduate school. If you ever get there, you'll know what I mean. It's a great time. You have a great time. You do a lot of thinking and talking and arguing and partying as well when you can afford to do so. So, fun time, an interesting time. And also along the way, he found himself a girlfriend who he lived with but didn't marry. And they had a son together. Okay? And he stayed with this woman. He wasn't terribly promiscuous. He stayed with this woman for a long time, but he never married her. Okay? He wasn't interested in marriage. He wanted to be free. He didn't believe he needed to be married. He wanted to be free to do what he wanted to do. They loved each other, and I think that's clear, based on what he wrote later, that he did love her, but he didn't feel like he wanted to make a commitment. Okay? And maybe some of that might have come from his mother, who may have found this woman unsuitable. Okay? So I brought his book, Confessions. This is a great classic that's autobiographical. He actually starts out with his very early childhood and maybe goes a little bit overboard on how sinful you can be in your infancy. But it's all about how he developed and how he eventually converted. And what he says about this period of time is, he says, love lay outside their range. To me it was sweet to love and to be loved, the more so if I could also enjoy the body of the beloved. I therefore polluted the spring water, this is after, of course, he converted, polluted the spring water of friendship with the filth of concupiscence, which is, I guess, sort of like unhealthy desire. I muddied its clear stream by the hell of lust, and yet though foul and immoral in my excessive vanity, I used to carry on in the manner of an elegant man about town. I rushed headlong into love, by which I was longing to be captured. My love was returned, and in secret I attained the joy that enchains. I was glad to be in bondage, tied with troublesome chains, and with the result that I was punished with the red-hot irons of jealousy, suspicion, fear, anger, and contention. Now there you see somebody who's influenced not just by Christianity, but by Platonism, and he was. We'll talk about that. But that idea that the feelings of jealousy, suspicion, fear, anger, these are chains. These are, things that enslave people. Okay? He can see, looking back, that though these feelings were very exciting, he was enslaved by them, he says. Okay? So that was going on. So he was having a very good time. And at this point in time, he embraced a sort of philosophic religion, Manicheasm. Okay? Mani was a prophet from about the 3rd century A.D. Who had this view that the world was governed by two forces. Each were equal. Okay? The force of good or light and the force of evil and darkness. And that what was most important was this spiritual battle, and that people had to, embrace the good. They had to try to seek out the good and be on the right side of that battle. Okay, but it was an unending battle. Okay, and the problem with Manichaeism became, for Augustine later on, was that it made those two forces equal. Okay, call it a Gnostic religion, because it emphasizes what you can't see and what underlies things, the secret, hidden truths that underlie what you see in the world. So behind what you see is this battle, this constant battle between good and evil. Okay? So this made sense to him. And I have another, oh yes, I have another quote here from the Confessions. where he deals with this. He says, that explains why I fell in with men proud of their slick talk, very earthly minded and loquacious. In their mouths were the devil's trap and a bird-line compounded of the mixture and the syllables of your name, that of the Lord Jesus Christ and that of the Paraclete, the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, because Manicheans would try to combine their view of good and evil with the Christian belief in Jesus. The footnote here says the Manichees claim to be authentic Christians, Orthodox church members, having in their view only half the truth, and taught a version of the doctrine of the Trinity, a Christology which excluded the reality of the humanity of Christ, that spoke of Jesus as a Redeemer, and a doctrine that the Paraclete is the other self of many. Okay? So you can see where, from Orthodox Christianity's point of view, that would be a heresy. That would be a major mistake. So later on he could see that was a mistake, but at this point it makes sense to him. And part of the reason it made sense to him is it was philosophic as well as religious. It combined philosophy and religion, and he was very attracted to that because he was an intelligent, educated person, and he had been convinced that philosophy was a path to true knowledge. Okay? So any religious belief that would attract him would have to be one that paid good homage to philosophy and was in fact philosophic and not just a matter of faith. Okay? So then he began to explore what we call now Neoplatonism. Okay? So he went from being a Manichean to a Neoplatonist. Again, with the attraction that it is a sort of combination of philosophy and religion. And Neoplatonism stuck around for a long time, by the way. It went throughout the Middle Ages and into about I still see Neoplatonistic writings in the 19th century. Okay? There's a long, long history of Neoplatonism. It's the attempt to synthesize Platonic thought with Jewish or Christian thought and even Muslim thought. Okay? All three. And you can see some of the ideas that, when you think about it, do combine pretty well with these monotheistic religions. Okay? For instance, the Platonic idea of the forms, which are ideas that exist prior to and independent of the human intellect that we discover, supposedly. These are forms, represent the great truths, and the final form is the form of the good. Remember, in Plato's Republic, he describes it almost as a religious experience. We climb all the way up to this point where he cannot describe anymore to Glaucon and the others how he can get to the idea of the good. He says you have to find it for yourself. It's like an enlightenment that happens to you. Well, this sounds very much like a conversion experience, like inspiration. And so they began to say, you know, pretty much Plato knew the great Judeo-Christian truths while being a pagan and was able to discover these things through the use of his mind alone. Okay? And so let's find truth in Plato as well as our religion and combine the two. Okay? So there's a lot of ideas there, as you can see, which would attract the philosophic type who still wanted to explore religion. Okay? And I don't think Augustine ever completely got away from Plato, because you see in The City of God lots of evidence that influence of Plato is still there. But he changes eventually from looking at Plato and other philosophers as the top authorities to flipping to, you know, the biblically revealed God being the top authority with the philosophic sources as supports, if they indeed can be used in that way. Okay. All right. So what happened next is that he heard Bishop Ambrose of Milan preach in a way that appealed to him. He started to listen to Ambrose because he didn't preach straight out of the Bible alone, but he actually incorporated Platonic thought to Christianity and tried to do so in a way that supported Christianity. Okay? So he, like the Neoplatonists, claimed that what Plato was talking about as the good was God himself. Okay? And he confirmed to Augustine that reason could help us discover God, that one path to God is through reason, through philosophy. Okay? So this appealed to Augustine as an intellectual. He wasn't ready to let go of this idea that the human reason could give you the path to the truth. Okay? So the church seemed open to somebody like him. And he was attracted to Ambrose, who was, by all accounts, a charismatic speaker. Okay? And so he got hooked. Okay? This was the start of his conversion to true Christianity. Okay? Now, at that point, he had some problems. Okay, before I put that up, though, you don't need to write these down, but I just wanted to show you the titles of some of these chapters so that you can clearly see the influence that Plato still has, even in his writings in the City of God. And he's still grappling with it. Okay? He puts it in a different place, but he's still very much grappling with it. How Plato has been able to approach so nearly to Christian knowledge, that's still Neoplatonism. So it's interesting. Okay. So his conversion, okay, once he converted, and remember, conversion is one of these experiences that's sort of like, you know, a switch gets flipped on, and suddenly people aren't the same as they were before. This is what people say about it, okay? And it seemed to be the case for Augustine, because all of a sudden he saw his life in a different way, and some things were very uncomfortable, okay? First of all, he felt a sense of shame because he had done lots of bad things in his youth, you know. Again, he kind of beats himself up a little bit overly much, perhaps by our standards today, but you know, some of the things that he did, being extremely selfish, not marrying the woman he loved, which made her basically, you know, a social outcast and their child a bastard. At this time, that was not, you know, ever going to change. Okay? Those were selfish things, okay, and things that he couldn't undo. But he was caught with the situation. What do I do now? Okay, and he says this was a very, very difficult and painful decision to make. But he asked his mistress to leave. In 386, he asked her to leave, and she left, went back to Algeria with her son. And I don't know, I don't find any evidence of whether, you know, there was support forthcoming or anything like that. I suspect maybe there was, because she went her way back to their original homeland. And you would think that anybody who had converted would at least keep that in mind, the need to not abandon the family. But he couldn't live this life anymore, and he says this was the hardest part of this, because he truly loved her. But he had messed it up by not marrying her. His mother had then arranged to have him be married legitimately, but that never happened either, because by that time he was not... oh no, then I'm sorry. This is an explanation partly for what happened here. Before they parted company, I think his mother had started to arrange a marriage for him to kind of replace her, but that never happened. And after she left, he still had trouble staying chaste, so to speak. Okay, so he makes comment of that in the Confessions as well. Okay. So, in other words, before he converted, but when he was starting to have more of a conscience, he still was not capable of not having extramarital sex. Okay. So he confesses that. But at the age of 33, he converted. He then became a priest and then a bishop. Okay? So it's one of those stories of complete change. And I think that he does a very good job of showing that if you live that kind of a life, it comes with consequences that you can't get out of. You know, you can't really totally ever extricate yourself from. So one of the more interesting aspects of the Confessions is that he does fully acknowledge that. Okay, that's something that he cannot fully ever undo or get past. You know, he understands what he did, and he feels very sorrowful about it. All right, so in the Confessions, he credits his mother with his conversion, and this is why she was made a saint, is because apparently Monica did nothing but pray nonstop that her son would stop his sinful ways and you know, move on to something better. Okay, so that sounds plausible. You know, mothers. But, you know, part of his conversion definitely came from himself, in that he continued to be open to exploring ideas and possibilities. And I get the sense that even after his conversion, he continued to change. In other words, you know, it took a long time for him to fully understand the faith, to really fully understand his view of it. So, with what time we have left, I wanted to just explore some of the Neoplatonic arguments that Augustine uses, and that he got from Ambrose. And these are arguments that Arnhart, some of them Arnhart also covers in the book. So, I mean, this is a question that I would guess everybody has, right? Does God exist? Okay. And the most orthodox Christian response to that is yes, but you know that as a matter of faith. Okay? It's a matter of faith. God gives you the grace to have that faith. Okay? But Augustine did not rely just on faith, and does think that these arguments, and by the way, St. Augustine isn't alone. Aquinas, whom we'll also study, and other Christian thinkers along the way, continue to make these kind of arguments. Okay? So one of the arguments that Ambrose used that Augustine liked was from natural effects to supernatural. And this is just the old Platonic argument. It's well done in Plato's Laws, for instance, where he says, you know, if we look at the world and we observe what's going on, we see that everything has a cause. Everything has a cause, and that cause has a cause, and there's a chain of causation, okay? For every motion, everything that moves in the world. And so, if we think back far enough, it would seem rational, logical, that there has to be a first cause, a starting point, okay? And that starting point, Ambrose said, must be God, that creative force that made everything start. Okay? Now that's not an argument that supports the idea of a personal God. It's an argument that could be used by a deist even. Okay? It just means that he thinks that this first cause must exist for all the other things in the world to exist. So a contemporary equivalent of this might be the speculation over the Big Bang. Is the Big Bang, because we now seem to have a theory that says that the universe was created by this, you know, infinitesimally small particle that blew up, right? And so, you know, what caused that to happen? Okay. And so some people argue that that's proof of God's existence. But it doesn't prove a personal God. Okay, do you understand? It doesn't have anything to do with that. It's just a first cause. Another argument that he found attractive was from contingency. Okay? And this argument says that everything that we see around us is dependent or contingent upon other conditions. Okay? So, you know, I mean, we hear people say, for instance, if the planet wasn't just this far from the sun, you know, or if we were on Mars instead of here, we couldn't exist. You know, if everything wasn't just right, okay, then we wouldn't be able to exist. And no contingent being, they say, is the cause of the continuing existence of other beings. Okay, they can be the cause of motion. Okay, I can push you, make you move, but I can't cause your existence. Okay, so what or who causes existence itself and allows for these circumstances, the correct circumstances for things to actually exist as they do. Okay? So they conclude that a necessary being, a non-contingent being, something that isn't contingent or dependent upon something else, must exist, which is the cause that sustains all the contingent beings. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So still, again, it's not an argument that supports a personal God such as Christians believe in, but it does make people think about, is existence necessary? Is existence as we as human beings know it necessary? Well, no, it isn't. You know, for whatever reason, it isn't necessary. And now we know more about the fact that outside of here, it appears to be very rare, if non-existent, elsewhere. So I suppose that might help support that argument. All right, so, and then finally, another argument, similar but somewhat different, that Arnhart describes is from contingency of the cosmos as a whole. Okay? And actually, I kind of already leaped to this one, but if there's two ways to think about the cosmos, the universe as we know it, as either necessary, necessarily existing as it is, or not necessary, imagining that it could exist in a different form, or actually not at all. Okay? If it is not necessary, then it is contingent. And that means that it relies on something that is preserving it and being in its current form. Okay? So all of these arguments, I'll leave this up here for a little while, but all of these arguments go along with the idea that there needs to be some creative force, there needs to be some controlling element that is necessary, that was not itself created, that was not itself dependent or contingent upon anything else. Because the human mind can't fathom, truly can't fathom, absolute eternity. I mean, we say eternity, but we can't truly fathom it. As far as what we know, there has to be a start. There has to be a beginning point. Okay. Now, obviously, these types of arguments get us into the question is of if there's a beginning point, what came before it? Okay, and you can drive yourself crazy with these questions, right? But but this isn't a philosophy class, so we will not go too far there. But I think it's safe to say that he was attracted to these arguments because they made him wonder, you know, why is the world the way it is? Why do we exist? How did this happen? And if it could have happened in a very different way or not at all, you know, is there some force and a mind of sorts involved in making this happen? Okay. I'll read you that passage from Arnhart here. I think he does a very good job of trying to describe these arguments, probably better than me, but he says, the strength of the Christian position should be clear, for it seems plausible that, at least in principle, our universe is only one possible universe of many. The laws of physics could be different from what they are. If they were, we would live, let us hope we would be a part of it, in a different universe. We probably wouldn't, I would say. Yet, if a radically different universe was possible, then it is also possible for there to be no universe at all, because our universe does not exist by necessity. Therefore, the continuing existence of the universe from one moment to another can be sustained only by a power beyond the natural universe itself, a supernatural cause of some sort. Supernatural in the most precise sense of not being natural, right? So imagine non-existence. And this butts heads with the pagan view, which sort of just accepted the idea that things had always been the way they were and would always continue to be that way. They didn't think about, you know, what is the first cause, or what was the starting point, okay? Plato kind of brought that up, right? But the typical way of thinking was, this is just a given. This is a given, you know, this is the way it is. We're not questioning where it came from, and also whether it will end, which is another thing that Christianity gets into, right? So it sounds like Augustine and Plato have a lot in common, and Augustine was attracted to Christianity through Platonism, okay? But as we will see as we start to explore this work, there are some big differences, and this is what he had to embrace when he really became a Christian, okay? For instance, for Plato, you know, the human soul looked like this. It had three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. And it could be disordered, and that was injustice, right? So if your appetites rule you, or if your spirit rules you, then you're an unjust person. But through philosophy, okay, you can right yourself, okay? You can make yourself a just person through understanding fully what justice is, and you get that through philosophy. So human beings alone are enough. We have enough to be able to make ourselves just, okay? Augustine, when he became a Christian, had to accept the idea that human beings cannot right themselves, okay? He did agree that injustice looks like this, that your passions are ruling you, your spiritedness is ruling you. But he says this is caused by sin. And sin is an aspect of human nature. It's original sin, okay? Because he did embrace the idea of the fall of man, depicted in the book of Genesis, right? So for him, because of the original sin, Adam in the garden, you know, receiving the apple from Eve, etc., you know, in whatever way that he understood that, basically he embraced the idea that human beings were marked by this original sin, and that it was impossible for us to free ourselves by ourselves through reason or through any other means, okay? So we have to have the intervention of God, okay? And in particular, the redemption that comes from faith in Christ, okay? So the intervention of God is necessary in order to become a good person. And actually, in this view, one can only be so good, okay? Because even after conversion, and once one has accepted Christianity, that does not make one perfect, right? There's always temptations to sin. This remains a part of a person's character, okay? And the only way to escape from it is to concentrate on and try to embrace the faith to the full extent. But it doesn't make one perfect, right? So there's no path to perfection on this planet from this perspective. One becomes perfected only in heaven, okay? So a major difference, then, is the idea of original sin. And that's a huge difference. And for him, it's the difference between the wisdom of his religion and the wisdom of philosophy. Because he began to see that the philosophers were, in his words, vain. That they were vain if they thought that human reason could perfect people, that they were engaging in pride or arrogance if they really thought that people could fix their problems all by themselves. Okay? And instead, he feels as though human nature is always tainted, it's always in need of the assistance of something much greater than human beings. And also, and this is key to what we'll talk about, human sin, sinfulness, human nature, as he depicts it, is the reason why we need a strong government. Okay? And it's also the reason why government is often repressive, because human nature often forces government to be repressive. He doesn't advocate tyranny, but he does feel as though human beings need very strong law and order, because in this world there's so great a temptation to misbehave, there's so great a temptation to break the law and to break morality and so forth. If you don't have that strong government, you will have utter chaos. And so this is what makes him what we call a Christian realist. Okay? He accepts the bad behavior as something that we have to deal with in this world. Okay? And we can't get around it. And even Christians can be subjected to it. And so you need to have a good government that really helps keep people in check. Okay?